it's flexible, you're working for yourself, and you really add value to these companies where they kind of look at you like the expert in the room when you find the right fit.
Hey team, Sid here with DevOps Directive, where it's my job to help you level up your DevOps and cloud infrastructure skills. If that sounds interesting to you, consider subscribing. Today, I'll be covering the topic of freelance consulting, which can be both a fulfilling and lucrative endeavor for software engineers, and happens to be my primary source of income. I've also brought on an expert guest. Today, we'll be talking through everything you need to know, from honing your niche to finding clients and landing contracts to how to structure your business. Let's get into it. I'm here with Bradley Jacobs, founder and CEO of Mylance, a company that helps people turn their expertise into freelance consulting businesses. I know Bradley from my time at Duke University. After graduating from Duke with a degree in mechanical engineering, Bradley spent a few years working in management consulting in DC before joining Uber in 2014. There, he spent 4.5 years launching and scaling marketplaces across the rides, eats, and freight lines of business. After leaving Uber in 2018, he channeled his operations expertise into a freelancing business, helping other startups build out their own marketplaces. Working just 25 to 30 hours a week, he was averaging over $20,000 a month. He realized that this freelancing thing was kind of amazing and decided to launch Mylance, his current company, which helps professionals launch and manage their own freelancing businesses. At this point, I'll hand it over to you, Bradley. Can you tell us a little more about what Mylance is?
Yeah, I appreciate the intro and for having me. And you nailed it, right? We take people that have already that experience either at a successful startup or big tech company, and they want to work for themselves for the flexibility, for the fulfillment, but they don't know how to hone their niche, set their rate, find clients, negotiate a good deal on down the line. And so we really help them create this business around themselves and around the experience that they have. We have a 2-week boot camp that we run people through. It's essentially this crash course in everything you need to know, from legal business setup to the accounting piece to that niche piece that we talked about. And then we help sustain their freelance life as well. We have a community, and we have, you have your access to a CPA and a lawyer, and we bring in projects to the community as well. So yeah, I appreciate you having me on here.
Cool. Yeah, I'm super excited to leverage both your personal expertise as a freelancer and experience, as well as your sort of ability to assess it at a meta level from now working with tons of clients across many different verticals. So I hope between the two of us, me in the software engineering space, you in the operations space, and all the Mylance clients, will be able to provide some rich context for others who are hoping to get into freelancing and consulting work.
Yeah, and I think what we'll talk about is it almost doesn't matter exactly what your skill set is in, right? We had a lawyer come through our boot camp. You're obviously an engineer. I'm in operations. Marketing is a big topic for this, right? I mean, you can really have any area of expertise and make it as a freelance consultant. And I've seen that through our boot camp. So excited to chat through these different topics and see how they apply to everybody.
And so before we even dive into some of the specifics, I think there's sort of a couple of prerequisites that we might want to talk about. And that includes both sort of why freelancing is an attractive opportunity, and also whether freelancing is right for me as an individual.
Yeah, definitely. I think for the first part of why it's attractive, it's flexible, you're working for yourself, and you really add value to these companies where they kind of look at you like the expert in the room when you find the right fit. And it's really empowering to have that kind of relationship. So that's one of the reasons I loved it. It enabled me to start Mylance, where it really funded my life while I was starting this business. For other people, it might support a family or fund a passion of yours. But for me, it was for starting my own company. And then as far as the prerequisite, I think it's really a number of years of experience and a specific skill set that's going to add value to another company. I don't think you can do it right out of college or even with a year or two experience. I think the best consultants really have at least 4 or 5 years experience in a specific area that they can then add value to another company.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. One reason that I was really excited about freelancing is that I started doing it in a period between full-time jobs where I was coming off of a bit of a burnout, and I found that being able to work for multiple clients for a smaller portion of my time and really segment my life in that way helped me to separate work from life a bit more than I was able to in a full-time role. So that was another sort of added benefit for me.
Yeah, and I've also seen people that work across a number of companies, you really get to see what it's like at that company, So if you are looking for a full-time gig at the end of the day, you almost get this trial where they're seeing how good you are. You see if it's a good fit on your side. And actually you end up getting maybe a way better role and a higher compensation package because they see what you're really capable of, which wouldn't really come out necessarily in just some interviews. So we've seen that as well.
Definitely. So you mentioned having a number of years of experience in a particular domain so that you can set yourself apart from the potential competition. How can you help to identify exactly what niche you want to focus on as a potential freelancer? Are there any tips you can provide for that?
This is one of the biggest things that people come to us asking about. And there's two main exercises that we walk them through. The first one is list out your professional accomplishments. What value have you added to a company? And try and make it as tangible as possible, right? Really use metrics to drive what impact you had. And then think critically, what makes me special that I was able to do that? What skills do I have? And it may sound pretty basic, but when you actually write that stuff down, you're kind of also impressed with yourself to some degree and you see what you're capable of. And you're essentially honing your niche in that way. And then you can whittle down and decide, what do I actually want to put as far as my personal brand? But we found those two exercises to be really helpful for people.
Nice. Do you have a personal example from when you were consulting, sort of how you would frame your particular niche?
Yeah, it's a great question because I'm in operations, right? And if I go to a company saying I'm really talented at operations, it means nothing, right? So my niche was always, I help 2 and 3-sided marketplaces automate their processes so they're enabling scale. And that meant a hell of a lot more to a company than, oh, I'm really good at operations, which doesn't help.
Yeah, I've found something similar within the software space where I could brand myself as a generalist full stack web application engineer, but instead by focusing in on DevOps, or the intersection of development and operations, and even more specifically on sort of helping seed and Series A companies scale their business as they find that product market fit and really need to move from a fairly simple deployment process to a much more scalable system on one of these major cloud providers. That's really where I've found my niche as I've worked within this space.
And that makes all the difference in the world, right? A software engineer, there are millions of them. Whereas the second part of what you described makes you unique. And then you can command a much higher rate and find the right fit from a client perspective.
And so once you've figured out that niche, what do? You've written down all your skills and accomplishments. You've decided, here is my thing that I'm going to go out and conquer the world in this particular domain. What do I do to find potential clients? Where do I start?
Yeah, generally it's with your network, right? It's people that know you, ideally have worked with you. And so you kind of skip that vetting process, if you will. And so we tell people there are some marketplaces, but they're not completely robust yet, at least for the skilled freelance space. So go to your network and talk to past managers, past colleagues, even friends, and just start talking to them. Hey, what's going on with your business? Ask a lot of good questions. That's what we encourage people to do. I found a lot of clients just by asking good questions. And you never know where it's going to lead, whether it's a potential engagement with them or they refer you to, oh, I have this friend who might really need you, and they make an introduction. And that introduction is way more powerful than any cold outreach you could do.
For sure, for sure. And when you're reaching out, are you thinking phone calls, texts, emails, LinkedIn? What is your platform of choice, or is it does it depend?
It does depend. I think the more personal the relationship, you can shoot a buddy a text and say, hey, can we jump on a call? Would love to catch up. You can really make it sound very friendly, and it is. If it's a little less familiar, then you can do LinkedIn, you can do email. I prefer email over LinkedIn. People get spammed on LinkedIn all the time. I'm sure you do too. So yeah, I would recommend the more personal, the better, but curious if you have a different experience there.
No, I think assessing the depth of the relationship that you have with the person and addressing them along the channels that you would normally talk to them makes the most sense. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Right. And I'm curious for you, Sid, how did you find your first client? I'm always being asked how I found my first one, and some of the hardest to just break into it is finding that first client. So how did you find yours?
Yeah, exactly. And I actually kind of stumbled into it. I was in a period between jobs and taking a little bit of time off to decompress. I was writing articles, and I wrote an article about comparing the different pricing of managed Kubernetes offerings across the major cloud providers. So essentially, I did a little bit of analysis to say, does Google Cloud or Microsoft Azure or AWS or DigitalOcean have the best rates for running Kubernetes, which is a platform for scalable web apps? And I hadn't seen anything out there like that, but I did this analysis, wrote the article, and just by chance, I posted it on Hacker News just to see if it would take, and it did. So I made it to the front page of Hacker News with that article, which was a great stroke of luck. And then a friend saw the article on the front page of Hacker News, knew that I was in between jobs, and texted me saying, hey, Sid, have you ever worked with Kubeflow, which is a machine learning platform on top of Kubernetes? And I actually had not, but I had worked a lot with Kubernetes on GCP, which is the cloud provider that this company was working with. And so I said, no, but like, do you want me to do some research and learn about it and see if I can help you out? And so that started the conversation. And then a few weeks later, I was helping them migrate most of their infrastructure onto this Kubeflow platform. And so it turned out to be happenstance, but a lucky coincidence that really worked out quite well.
Yeah. And you say it's lucky, right? But to some degree, you made your own luck there, right? You went through the work of posting an article and putting yourself out there, which a lot of people find intimidating, and it is, right? But you took that leap and one thing led to another and you had your first client. So it's pretty cool to hear about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think around the blog, probably why yours is successful is the content that's on there, right? It's not that the blog is so beautiful or anything like that. It's that you're demonstrating your area of expertise, which gives you credibility, right? So I think you can do that even on LinkedIn. You can write posts and articles on LinkedIn about, I could write about how I would scale up a two-sided marketplace that's B2B, for example, right? And that just gives me credibility that I know what I'm talking about. So a potential client might see that and say, oh, maybe he can help us.
Yeah. And like you said earlier about coming into a client pre-qualified, if they're in your personal network, showing your expertise via a written article or a YouTube video or whatever can help to minimize the eventual interview process, right? They just watched you for an hour explain this technical topic in depth that is quite similar to what they're trying to accomplish. And so I've had clients that there was no interview. They saw my video, they reached out, I gave them a project proposal, and we were working on that the next week. So I think it can be powerful from that aspect as well.
Most often when it's a good fit, it happens really quickly, right? If the interview process needs to be 5 interviews, then for a consulting gig, I think you probably didn't do a good enough job, or it's not a good enough match early on. And that just may be the reality.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so you found some potential clients. It seems like it's a good fit. You're talking to them. Are there any tips you can give for closing that deal, right? So you've found them, you're starting to figure out what a project would look like or what the scope of the engagement would be. How can we ensure that we're going to land that client versus someone else, or versus them potentially not going forward with the project?
The first thing you want to do is make sure it is a really good fit. And they should always, we say this to our customers, they should need you more than you need them, right? So immediately you have leverage, you can walk away. And even if that's not necessarily as true as it could be, that's the air that you want to have, right? And I think, so that's number one. And then number two is really understanding their needs and making them feel heard, right? Understanding how much cash do they really have? What is possible that they could pay you? Do they already have people working on the problem that they're going after? Make sure that there's alignment there and that they really feel understood. I think any negotiation, if you can make your counterpart feel heard, you're more likely to get what you want. And then the last part is find a way to get started, right? We all want these big contracts that are well paying, 6 month long, something like that. If you can get that, great. But we often tell people, do a 30, 60-day trial, if you will. Start small, and you can always go change from there. So that's one of our recommendations, is just find a way to get started and then prove your value, and you'll get more money after that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that once you're in and working for a company, if you can over deliver on what they were expecting, it's very easy to then expand the scope of the project or do follow-on work with them.
Yeah, it's a good point you bring up, right? It's getting started, but then crushing those first 30 days.
Okay, let's move on to the topic of scoping projects. How should I, as a freelancer, think about taking maybe a broad idea that a potential client comes to me with of, oh, I want to scale this market, or oh, I want to take my delivery process and automate it, and how do I turn that into a scope that will benefit both me and the customer optimally?
I think this is one of the hardest things that a freelancer has to do. And part of it is difficult because companies don't know what they want. They don't know what they need. They can't tell you if you just asked, what's the scope of this? They have no idea. And so it's frankly a challenge to go from, as you said, that problem statement to a solidified project. And what we tell people do is just ask a ton of questions, right? Ask what needs to be delivered on, what their challenges are, what they've tried already, what they're expecting from you. If you just keep asking questions and take as detailed notes as you can, then once you send out that proposal, I even use their language in that proposal, right? Here's what I'm good at. Here's what the company's challenges are. And here's what I'm going to deliver to solve those challenges. And often if you can use the words that they did, they feel heard, going back to the negotiation point. And they're like, this guy gets it. He's the right person for the job. He's in.
And then what are your thoughts on billing structure? So we've come up with a project. Do I break it down and say, oh, I think this is going to take me a week to do this part and 2 weeks to do that part, so I'm going to bill them hourly, or I'm going to bill them monthly? Or should I just scope the whole thing at once and bill them for the project? What are the trade-offs there?
Yeah, hourly is tough because you're keeping a timesheet. They have to review it. Your incentives are misaligned because they don't want you to work as much because you're probably expensive. You want to work more because you want to make more money. I did hourly with my first project and I never did it again. So I'm against hourly personally. I recommend monthly retainers where you're saying, I think it's going to take about X number of hours per week. You come up with a rate per month and you're just billing them monthly. And the key there is to stay within 10, 15% of what you expect, right? If you're expecting 15 hours a week, if it's getting much more than 18 to 20, then you need to either scale back or have a conversation about increasing compensation. The challenge with project based is that, let's say it's a 6-week long project, inevitably there's going to be feedback. The project might go on longer than you think, or there's just a misalignment there. And the client has no incentive for the project to end on time, right? But you have all the incentive in the world. And so it ends up with kind of that conversation 2/3 of the way in to say, hey, we're not on the right timeline here. Do we expand the scope? Do we cut some of it off? It ends up being pretty messy from my experience. And so monthly retainers reduces those other challenges that I mentioned with hourly and project based. And often they go on longer too. It's just so much easier to renew a monthly retainer versus scoping out a whole new project. So that's my experience, but I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of both. I think one thing that's really nice about hourly is that there is less requirement to fully scope the project up front, because as long as they're willing to accept the fact that your hourly bid might be extended if they expand scope, if you can agree on an hourly rate that you're both happy with, and then you're delivering quality work, up front, you don't need to have every single deliverable laid out, because you can add scope and then it just adds hours. So that's the primary benefit I see in hourly, but I agree with a lot of your points about sort of moving towards a broader timescale helps to smooth the curve and easier to work with, et cetera.
Yeah. And I wonder if there's a balance where you agree to a monthly retainer and then in the contract, you even say, if it ends up requiring additional hours, it'll be mutually agreed upon this many hours at this rate. And so then you're not back to the drawing board with negotiation, but you can still expand the scope. Because you're right, it's hard to scope out these projects day one. So maybe there's a balance and flexibility there.
I've done something like that where a contract will have an agreed upon hourly rate for support for some period after the contract ends. So let's say I'm delivering some software product to them. After that is complete, we've agreed, at whatever rate for the next 3 months, you can have up to 5 hours a week or 10 hours a week of a support contract.
Yeah. And I think I've had one of those too. Just keep me on retainer, need to pick up the phone and call me about something. I'll be there. And honestly, usually they don't use it up, which is nice on my end.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, if you can get that, it's a good spot to be in, obviously.
Yeah, for sure. And then how do you think about pricing? Obviously, you want to position yourself as this expert such that you're less, you're approaching less price sensitive clients. How do you approach that problem?
It's a tough one. And the first client, I'll be honest, I completely made up. I took a model and threw in some numbers of what I thought sound quote reasonable and tacked on a premium and I charged it. And I will say, I think you need to do the math for you of taking into account. I know we're going to talk about some costs as a freelancer, but you have some additional taxes and you're running your own business. You have those additional costs. So you can't just take your previous salary, divide by number of hours and say, this is my hourly rate, right? So I recommend maybe you start there, but add a good 40% on top of that, and at least have that as a starting point to negotiate from. This is what I'm going to charge you. The other thing I would say is, to the extent that you can really focus on output and value to the company and get a little bit less away from your hourly rate, at least when you're talking about it. Yeah, it's be like, I'm going to deliver this thing. It's going to be millions of dollars of value, hopefully, to the company, right? So if you're paying me $10,000 a month, it's really a drop in the bucket, right? And so it's a tough question though. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree completely. I think the key to charging more is to separate your hourly rate from the value of what you're delivering. If someone looks at an hourly rate of above, I don't know, a few $100s an hour, there's an immediate pullback of like, why is it worth this much? I mean, you look at lawyers and their hourly rates and they're kind of crazy. But if you look at it from a value delivery standpoint, it's a much easier pill to swallow, even if you can then back out. So, I mean, your customers are smart. They can look at how long it's going to take you and do the math. But from a mindset perspective, attaching it to that value and detaching it from you working hourly is really, I think, the key shift to charging more.
And I think the lawyer point is a good one because they're able to command $300, $400, $500 or more per hour because of that degree that they have, right? It's hard to get that degree. It's an expensive degree. And I try and think about it with our customers of the quote degree that you got at your past company, that past accomplishment, that past role, they're paying for that, right? So when I would talk about myself, I launched Uber Freight and I was one of very few people in operations that had tech experience, but logistics experience, which is an antiquated industry. And they're essentially paying for that expertise, right? And maybe it's just to make myself feel better for the rates that I was charging. But to get over that kind of imposter syndrome of I can command this rate, that's how I think about it.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned 40%. This was in the context of sort of comparing your W-2 salary to what you would need to make as a freelancer, I think, to make it sustainable. Is 40% a good rule of thumb, would you say?
I think it is. You could go a little bit higher even. You could do 50%, and then you're probably going to need to negotiate down. But when you think about the additional costs, for me, I had a bookkeeper, I had to pay a CPA a little bit more for my taxes. Health insurance was a decent cost. And there's a self-employment tax that you need to pay.
Yep.
So yeah. And at the end of the day, hopefully it's a win-win because the company's getting me for maybe more per month than they'd get an employee, but they're not committing to me for years, right? So they get me for 3, 4, 5 months. It's way cheaper than getting me for the year, but they still get the experience and the expertise to make them successful. So I think 40, 50% it seems like a lot, but I think it's right.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And then I think there's another component that we haven't touched on yet, and that's that as a freelancer, it can be very hard to fill a full week of billable time. If you're working hourly, that is. If you're billing monthly, then that's a little easier. But if you are sending invoices by the hour, you're not going to have 50, 60 hours a week of billable time. How do you think about that and building that into the equation?
And the data shows that 50% of a freelancer's time is spent doing admin, non-earning activities like lead gen and the back end office stuff. The infrastructure just isn't there, which is part of what we're trying to tackle at Mylance. But yeah, I think you need to budget time to do those kinds of things, especially lead gen, right? I mean, contractor, you could get cut at any day and you should kind of expect to some degree. So we recommend spending a few hours a week, maybe pick an hour or two Tuesdays and Thursdays, something like that. And you do some lead sourcing, right? And you do some outreach and set up some calls with your network so that you have this pipeline. That's an ideal scenario where you could pick up the phone and basically get a new client if you need to.
Yeah. And in that same vein, how many clients do you think is optimal for a freelancer to have? I tend to have 2 at a time, such that when one drops off, I can sort of pick back up on some of the business development or lead generation work. Yeah. What are your thoughts there?
I think the fewer the better. I think that's right. It's, as you said, it's a balance, right? You don't want one because then if you get cut, you have no income. But the more you have, it's just tough to balance, right? They have needs. They want things from you all the time. And so I think 2 or 3 is a sweet spot. I did 4 or 5 at one point, and it was a lot. I think the exception is some of the operations consultants can be more advisors. And so if you're advising companies for a few hours a week, you could have 6, 7 clients and the time commitment's not too bad. But if you're doing execution based work, I think 2 or 3 is that good sweet spot.
Yeah, the context switching for me, if I had more than 2, you just lose so much productivity that wouldn't be good for me or for the client, really.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And you mentioned some of this administrative work taking up a lot of time for a freelancer. Let's shift towards business structure and how to think about setting things up. We need to make sure we pay our taxes correctly, but we want to make sure we optimize our business structure so that those taxes are not more than they need to be. Can you talk a little bit about the different options out there for freelancers in terms of how they want to set up their business?
Yeah, and it is a loaded question. We'll see what we can cover here. You can be a sole prop, and that's you operating under your name, right? That's
Sole proprietor, yeah.
Yeah, it's a sole proprietor.
Got
Or you can form an LLC. And
Okay.
just with those two specifically, the only difference is actually on the legal side. That doesn't impact the accounting side at all. The LLC, unless it's taxed differently, unless you designate it, it is a flow through entity and it does not impact your taxes. But what it does help you is sleep better at night knowing if something were to happen with your client and they, for some reason, want to sue you, they would sue your LLC, which probably doesn't have a whole lot of assets in it, versus coming after you personally, where your personal assets would be at risk.
Mm-hmm.
So we recommend forming an LLC. And then, really, to your question around structures from a tax optimization standpoint, you can choose your LLC to be taxed as an S-corp. And unfortunately, there's no one rule of thumb of should you do it or should you not. Every state has a different impact. You're single versus married, how much money you make. And so you really need to talk with a CPA, or you can come message me at Mylance and we'll help you. But the way an S-corp works at a very high level is you are an employee of your own LLC. It's an LLC taxed as an S-corp, and you pay yourself a salary. And the rest that's not paid as a salary is actually paid to yourself as a distribution or a dividend. And those are taxed differently. And so the lower your salary, the more the dividend, and the dividend is taxed much less than your salary. And so that's how you can come out. I actually came out probably $12,000 ahead by having an S-corp versus just a pass-through entity LLC when I was consulting.
And you touched on a couple of things that I think are worth calling out there. One, I think there's a lot of confusion around S-corp and that it is a tax designation. It is not an entity. So I think that's a key point to call out. Also, you mentioned the payment of yourself as a salary and that being different than the dividends. I think there's some laws around the minimum amount that you're allowed to pay yourself, right? It must be reasonable.
It must be reasonable.
And so you obviously want to talk with someone who has a lot of context in both the tax law and potentially your industry to know what reasonable means from the context of the IRS, right?
That's right. And it's crazy to me personally that they leave it that subjective of what's, quote, reasonable. But yeah, you need to work with your CPA and decide together what you are both comfortable with paying yourself. And you do want it to be as low as possible, but you need it to be within defensible reason.
Where would I go as a freelancer to find a professional to help me with that? A CPA, a tax professional, a lawyer, if there's some other thing that I need. How can I find reliable professional help with my freelancing business?
People are going to friends, folks are going online and Googling freelance lawyer. We have that at Mylance. So if you are looking for it and watching this, please come to us. You can check out our website and message us. We have a Slack channel with accountants and lawyers and just get your questions answered.
Nice.
So yeah, you can definitely come to us. A lot of people try and get free advice from their family, friends, if they are lucky enough to have that. But otherwise, yeah, it's not the easiest thing in the world. And again, the infrastructure isn't built out yet for freelancers. So if you're looking for it, I'd love to chat with you.
So that takes care of things from a business structure. What about from like a organizational or operational structure? I have only operated as a single freelancer working on my own project. I haven't tried subcontracting out any work or working with a team. Have you given much thought to sort of how freelancers should approach that?
There's no one right answer, I'll tell you, but I do think there are incredible opportunities to go get a high paying client based on your credentials and then outsource some of the work, especially some of the really manual work, right? One of my projects, I had to do a lot of research and I just needed a list of people to talk to. And so I found someone on Upwork for $10 an hour, and they were able to get me a list of a few hundred people that cost me, I don't know, $100 or something like that. And it was just a great almost arbitrage opportunity for me. And I've also outsourced to some of my friends, right? I mean, folks that I've worked with at Uber and past in my consulting days, they have this great experience. They don't really know how much I'm getting paid. I pay them what we agree to, that we agree is fair.
Mm-hmm.
And I deliver on the project. And so the one thing to be careful of there is sometimes it's in the contract that you have to get permission to subcontract or you can't. So take a look at that before you do anything. But yeah, I think there's definitely opportunities. And I didn't do this, but I did think about getting a virtual assistant just to help me with managing the admin pieces of my business. So it's definitely worth looking into because they can be pretty cheap. And the last thing I'll mention is you're still accountable for the work, right? So make sure that these are people you trust, or if you don't necessarily know them, that you're really auditing their output, because at the end of the day, it is your name on the line and you want to make sure that you have this great relationship with that company. So just keep that in mind.
I think that is a great point and leads right into the next question around execution. So it is your name on the line. You're the one that set up this project and you're the one delivering on it. What do you need to think about as a freelancer in terms of execution? What are the key aspects? Obviously, you've got to knock it out of the park, but how do you go about doing that?
I think it's really similar to joining a company as an employee. You get in there day one, you align expectations. What does success look like? How are we going to communicate? How often, what modes of communication? Is it Slack, email, text, whatever it is, and really have the expectations clearly outlined. So I think if you're doing a good job, your proposal is very detailed. You're copying the proposal to the contract, you're signing the contract, and then you're copying the contract over into a document that's shared to say, I'm going to do these 12 things and I'm going to track my progress in this doc. So anytime you need to know what I'm doing or have some feedback or whatever it is, we have a shared document that we've agreed upon of what I'm going to execute on. So that's what I'd recommend. But as anything, any relationship, it comes down to communication and just being as proactive as possible, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. I use that exact tactic of having a shared doc. I have weekly meetings with sort of the main point of contact at one of my major clients. I put stuff in there throughout the week. We then meet, go through everything that I've included, and really just use that to stay on the same page in terms of where we're at, where we're going, and any potential issues along the way, and we can resolve them as soon as possible.
So I think that's right. And the part that doesn't get at is more of the softer feedback of, right, that's the project feedback. And I've found it incredibly challenging to get that kind of feedback from consulting clients that you would normally get in a full-time job. And so what I ended up doing is I made a feedback form. I made people fill it out of what's Bradley that's going well and what's Bradley doing that could be better. And they were both required fields. And I sent it not only to the person I was reporting to, but some other folks I was working with at the company. And because otherwise I would just get, yeah, you're doing great, right? Everything's great, right? And look, that's not really helpful. And I'm sure there's always things that could be different or better. So that's something that I did and I've recommended to folks, but I'm curious if you've explored anything like that or.
I have one client now that I've been working with for over 6 months. And so they had their regular, I don't know if they do biannual or annual, but their review process for all their employees. And I reached out to my primary contact and said, oh, like, do you normally do this with freelancers? Even if the answer is no, I would like to have this type of feedback session with you. And that was able to help us have a really candid conversation around, hey, here's what's going well, specifically, not just, oh, here, you're doing great, but specifically, here's what we think is going really well. And here's a couple of areas that we think could potentially be improved. And so, yeah, I think calling that out specifically is a really important tactic, because otherwise it's much easier to just skip the hard conversations. But it is in both parties' interests to bring everything out onto the table so that you can improve anything that needs to be improved.
Yeah, and it's not just with that client, right? I mean, that definitely helps that relationship and you deliver on those projects. But as a freelancer, one thing very few people talk about is that professional development for yourself, because you're usually not part of that performance review process. So if you can somehow get yourself in there like you did, then you really get those development areas that, frankly, you're not really getting otherwise. So I think it's smart that you did that.
And then once you've executed on a contract, you've completed the scope of work, you've done a great job, they've given you all this amazing feedback, they've sent your final check. What do you do then? Are there any steps that you recommend for sort of closing out a contract that would be beneficial for me as a freelancer?
Well, I definitely try and extend the project before we got there, right?
Okay.
I mean, your best way to get new clients, or I'd say just more work, is to extend your existing projects. And usually that can go pretty well, at least for until a certain period of time. The last piece would be, if it's really ending and that last payment is sent, ask for referrals, right? I mean, that's the best way to get new clients. If you have a happy existing client that just doesn't need you anymore for whatever reason, they have other friends in companies, running companies in leadership positions, and you say, hey, really enjoyed working with you. Is there an opportunity for even an introduction, right? And I wouldn't even phrase it like that. The phrasing is important to say, who can you introduce me to in your network that could be a potential client, right? Because they're more likely to do it that way.
All right, Bradley, thanks so much for discussing that. I hope we shared some information that is of value to the audience. I think we did based on our discussion. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much and take care.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.